Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Michelle Allendoerfer, APSA's Senior Director of Teaching and Learning. On behalf of APSA, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on teaching the 2024 election. This is the third in a series of webinars APSA has been hosting, focusing on the 2024 election through a variety of different perspectives. You can find the recordings of the first two webinars on APSA Educate, and I'm going to put the link in the chat, as well as registration details for upcoming events as they are scheduled. Before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping notes. First, we ask all webinar participants to adhere to APSA's Respect campaign. The Respect campaign encourages professional respect by and towards all APSA event attendees and participants at all times. Respect stands for respectful, equitable, safe, professional, and ethical conduct towards all. The APSA Sexual Harassment Survey Report, Anti-Harassment Policy, and Code of Conduct all address the importance of facilitating a climate of respect at all events. And you can learn more about the Respect campaign and Code of Conduct on APSA's website. Throughout the event today, please feel free to use the Q&A box to ask any questions. We will do Q&A towards the end. And we will be recording this event and making it available on APSA's website shortly. On APSA Educate, we will share the recording as well as related resources. And we invite anyone who's watching today or watching the recording later on to share any resources that are related to teaching the 2024 US election. You could go to APSA Educate, click on the submit button to submit resources, or you could email those resources to educate@apsanet.org. We also invite other resources on APSA Educate more broadly. Finally, you can enable closed captioning using the menu option below if you need that. And we are fortunate to have with us today an incredible group of scholars to share how they are thinking about teaching the 2024 election. First, we have Dr. Allison Rank. Allison is Associate Professor of American Politics at SUNY Oswego. Her research agenda focuses on political science pedagogy, campus-based civic engagement, and pop culture and politics. In addition to teaching traditional political science courses, she serves as the campaign manager for the campus-wide voter mobilization program Vote Oswego and coordinator of SUNY Oswego's broader civic engagement efforts. Dr. Athena King is an assistant professor of political science and geography at Old Dominion University. Her research agenda focuses on African-American politics, race and ethnic politics, and American political development. And Dr. Juan Huerta is a professor of political science at Texas A&M University-Corpus Christi. He regularly teaches state and local politics, public opinion, Mexican-American politics, and undergraduate research methods. And he is the co-author of the textbook Practicing Texas Politics. Thank you all for being here, and let's get started. I'm going to go in alphabetical order by first name for this first question. So we will kick off with Allison. And just to sort of frame the discussion that we're having today, I'd like to hear from everybody as what do you see are some of the key challenges and opportunities in teaching during this particular campaign and election cycle? What have you seen or do you anticipate seeing students struggle with in the political science classrooms, especially but not limited to Introduction to American Politics or government classes? Allison?
Sure. So I actually tend to think that the challenge and the opportunity are almost the same thing, which is how very, very unsettled politics feels right now. And so students, I think, come in and that sort of feeling of being unsettled processes in either I don't want to engage with this at all because it's so unsettling. I kind of can't find a foothold. Or this is so unsettling. I'm completely churned up about like what it means in a way that makes it hard to kind of lock in on an actual study of politics. And to me, and I come out of an American political development background from my graduate degree, I actually think that this creates an incredible opportunity for talking within political science about the role of institutions, that we are actually living through a really unsettled time. Living through realignment is unsettling. Living through the decline of a political order and the rise of a new political order is going to be unsettling. And I think there's an interesting, in some ways, an opportunity to take the sort of challenge our students feel gaining a foothold in like, what is politics right now? And using it to actually talk about some of these really, I think, fundamental political science concepts about what happens when political orders change, and really taking on that opportunity to help students grapple with what institutional change means and how they can feel it themselves, even if they don't know how to put a name to it.
Okay, great. Athena?
I think my biggest challenge this semester is going to be how do I settle down the students who feel that they won't be part of that new order. And given some of the material that's come out, given some of the things that we've seen, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about Project 2025. I know that there will be students who will be angry, confused, scared, and it's going to be my job to help shepherd them through not only the semester, but everything that will be happening in the political sphere during that time. In my syllabus and on the first day of classes, I emphasize that every chapter that we will be talking about, every concept, we can filter it through the current political lens. And so, you know, instead of us just talking about civil rights, we will talk about what civil rights looks like now, what it could possibly look like depending on the results of the upcoming election, how the current president has addressed the notion of civil rights. And so I just see it as my job to just sort of shepherd them through, but to do so using the current political backdrop.
Boy, wonderful comments from my colleagues from the panel. You know, my mom loved politics, and we talked about politics all the time. And I used to tease her because she voted for Richard Nixon in 1968, and she was just so embarrassed by that vote. And then she would say, "I mean, do you understand, son, that the context at that time, things were really falling apart?" And I couldn't understand that. I was, you know, a baby, 1 year old during that election, so yeah, I didn't know what was going on. And as I've been thinking about it, now I'm starting to understand what she was talking about. This is a very contentious election where you really do feel like things that you thought were established, things were working, just are not there anymore. So to me, you know, I'm thinking about the challenges. You know, we're looking at a real threat to democracy in our nation, and our approaches talking about elections that we've done in the past, they may not work. You know, we talk about civil rights, talk about voting rights. These things may not make much sense. And a real challenge, you know, to me also is defending democracy, you know, without appearing partisan. You know, I was thinking too, you know, like how do you talk about white supremacy and white nationalism without, you know, drawing blowback? And in some states, like this one I'm in, you know, it can be contentious. Now, I live in a part of Texas that's not as divided as other parts of the state of Texas, but nonetheless, that's a challenge. But, you know, there are also opportunities, right? We talked about that. And to me, it's a real opportunity to talk about what it means to be a democracy. It's not just constitutions and laws, it's democratic values. And are we doing those things? So this could be an opportunity for us to talk about how can we expand democracy, deepen democracy, and also talk about what has led to democratic failure across the world and point out examples. And then we can ask ourselves, are we seeing signs of those things here?
Great, thank you. I'd love to ask a follow-up question before we move on to the next set of prepared questions, which is, how do you think about defending democracy without appearing partisan? So I'll open this up to all three if you've thought about this or have strategies or approaches.
What I try to do is do this through a comparative context. I talk about other nations that have seen democratic erosion, and I talk about how things have happened. How you had anti-system parties emerge, how sometimes there were coups, but it doesn't have to always be a coup, you know, the army coming in. It can be through gradual erosion. And I talk about a commitment to democratic values, that it's not just about laws and constitutions. And we'll talk about nations that have really nice sounding laws and constitutions, yet failed. So that's my segue into it. And then you can start seeing students realizing, oh, we're seeing elements of that here. But, you know, then, you know, I don't know if maybe my colleagues here have an answer for how to pull this one off. So that's why I want to go first.
Okay, I'll bite. Well, first of all, the very first chapter of my textbook, no matter what textbook I'm using, addresses this notion of democracy and constitutional democracy. And forms of government around the world. And so, you know, we spend a little more time than I would probably like to on that chapter, just so that they can understand that what we have is not only special, but it's fragile. You know, when we talk about authoritarianism or totalitarianism, you know, everybody can point to, oh, Hitler and Mussolini, blah, blah, blah. And they assume that it will never happen here. And so, you know, we spend a little bit more time not only talking about these different forms of government, but how, you know, democracy, especially a constitutional democracy, you might expect it to be ironclad, and some students think it is, but it's actually probably the most fragile of them all, if you ask me. And so I will spend, you know, considerable amount of time addressing, you know, what a constitutional democracy is, and how it is now viewed through the lens of all of the groups that when this document was born didn't have that freedom, but now they do. And it is just as fragile as the document itself. And so hopefully they're getting it, and, you know, hopefully they'll get it this semester.
See, one of the things that I try to do, which I think actually sounds a little bit less political science than what both of you are saying you do, which I'm now thinking about a little bit more carefully, is try to help students think through the difference of what are debates that happen within what I would call the rules of the game or the structure of democracy, and when are we transitioning to fighting over how we set up the game. And that those are two different conversations, or at least I think should be, that we should think carefully about when and how we have changed, who is in the conversation, how is the conversation set up, right? Like how are the rules of the game kind of set for decision making, and that's a different kind of conversation and a different kind of fight with different kinds of stakes than the debates that happen within the game in terms of particular policy making. And so trying to walk students through sort of the ways that how we institutionally set things up will necessarily lead to certain interests being more or less likely to happen, right? When students sort of get this idea of, well, we can't get the challenge of a third party is actually largely an institutional challenge that opens up a different set of conversations. And so I actually tend to come from it, I think, from less of like a technical explanation with them and more of trying to think about democracy as if that's the structure, there's a difference between trying to change that structure and what we do within the structure.
Great, thank you so much. So I guess this is probably, you know, the big question is, what ways do you typically bring ongoing, you know, current elections into your classroom? And then maybe a couple of sort of sub questions that you could pick and choose from. How might instructors need to approach this election year differently if they do? But I'm hearing from you already that yes, you think they do. So how might they be approaching this election year differently? In addition to thinking about how you teach in the lead up to the election, how do you think about those post-election classes, particularly maybe those immediate classes the day or two after the election? Do you have a plan of how you help students process whatever that outcome might be? And then also here, you know, please feel free to highlight specific resources or readings, activities, approaches that you do that might be of interest to others. If it's okay, maybe we'll do reverse alphabetical order by first name, if Carlos is willing to go first.
Okay, no problem. So that's a lot. So Michelle, if I missed something, be sure to prompt me and ask me. The first thing you asked about was how do I engage my students preparing them for elections? One of the big things we do is we spend a lot of time working about how to register to vote and how to become an engaged democratic citizen. So I do collaborate with different community organizations to come in and do voter registration drives in my big class. So this semester, I'm teaching undergraduate research methods class for political science majors. The other class is a big Texas government classroom, all like 200 some students in there. So we have a big voter registration drive. And I emphasize to students, look, this is not about partisan politics. I want you to be engaged, informed, democratic citizens. And so we have this voter registration drive. They find out it really is not that easy to register to vote. And so I'm really glad I have experts there from typically the League of Women Voters of Corpus Christi, and they can help the students and make corrections to their forms and get them registered to vote. We talk about how hard it is to vote by mail, but some of them choose to do that. And the thing I'm trying to do differently the last few, I think we'll do differently this time, is to really emphasize to them that elections have consequences. I think it's very easy to fall in this trap. Oh, it doesn't matter. My vote doesn't count. And I'll bring up something like the Dobbs decision that dealt with abortion rights, reproductive rights. And I'll tell them, look, I really don't care which side you fall on this, but don't tell me the elections don't have consequences. So people act all surprised. I mean, when Democrat and Republican presidents were appointing Supreme Court justices running for president, they told you what they were going to do if they win, what kind of justices they put on the Supreme Court. And guess what? That's what they did. And they made the ruling. Why are you surprised by this? They told you. So elections have consequences. I tell them too, you may want bigger differences between Democrats and Republicans or different candidates, but don't sit here and tell me they're the same, because they are not the same. There's fundamentally, there are differences here. So I emphasize to them, this makes a difference. And then I show them voting turnout by different age demographics, and show them turnout and preferences. So I'll say, here's how your age cohort typically votes, and here's the turnout. And I'll show them what's going on. So here's the cohort, older white Texans are dominating. Well, I don't break it down that much, but I'll show them older Texans are dominating the political landscape here. You're a huge group, but we also tie that into how hard it is for us to vote. So, Michelle, you asked how you put something else in there. So what was?
So also post-election classes. So
okay,
how might you? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I really do. Golly, I have a conference also after this election. In 2016, I remember at a conference right after the election, and my students wanted to talk to me. And instead, I was making last-minute edits to the textbook, and I wasn't there. So, the thing is, what I try to students is, just really seek to understand and listen to them. Because no matter how elections go out, someone's, they have a lot of questions about it. So, I certainly don't have all the answers, and I tell them I don't. But certainly, I will, I always want to listen to them, try to understand what they're doing. And if it's really, a serious issue they're going through, refer them to campus services, because, we're political science professors, we're not counselors. And some of the stuff they're going to go through may go beyond, well, it's a good chance it can go beyond our ability to help. So, yeah, we'll see. It's my first, I said I missed the 16 days. So it'll be very interesting for this one. You said about tools. I think you asked about how to get informed. We talk about, I know one of the things we asked to consider was like, how do you deal with, misinformation, disinformation, and sift through news? Because there is a lot of, they rely on social media and it's on TikTok and this like that. And one thing I encourage us to do is collaborate with our colleagues at our libraries. They have a lot of expertise on this and a lot of resources for this. We don't have to do this all by ourselves. For me, I try to point out to how the media covers elections and look for the pitfalls. I can't stand these narratives they love to use. When I say watch out for these little narratives, and think about credible sites, look at the source. Is anyone else running the same story? And then I am bringing in university, partners. We have some project called I Know on campus, and it really is about trying to find credible sources and sort through that. So I hope I addressed all the prompts that you had for us.
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay,
Athena, do you want to go next?
Okay. Usually every semester, at least every semester since I've been at Old Dominion, I've been fortunate that most of the students have either already registered to vote or have already voted in some election, whether it's a primary, special election, and some of them, if they're old enough and depending on when this is happening, maybe voted in the previous presidential election. So as far as the need to get students registered, it's not as crucial because so many of them already are. So, that's sort of a joy for me. But we do have on-campus services that allow them to register if they haven't done so already. One of the things that we talk about early on is policy preferences. And I tell them, I said, you don't have to tell me what your policy preferences are, but invariably they want to share. And so when they do, unprompted often, they learn that there are others who don't think the same way that they do. And how the students are just sort of like questioning each other. It's like, why do you believe that? I had, if you'll let me, I share a little anecdote. I had a student a few years ago who, first day of classes, I say, well, what are those things that you would like to see government change? And the student said something to the effect of they didn't like the mask mandates. And they actually used the phrase, my body, my choice. And I just asked a question. It's like, well, isn't that what people who are pro-choice say? And I didn't have to say another word because the other students picked it up and ran with it. So one thing that I see is that students are more than willing to share their policy preferences, even when I tell them I don't necessarily need to know them. But as far as like the elections are concerned and the issues, I tell them, your cohort does not participate as much compared to older people. So those policy preferences that you might have as a group, they're probably getting ignored because your generation isn't as politically active as, perhaps it should be. And it makes some of them think, well, okay, well, then maybe I need to do my part. As far as like misinformation and disinformation, I do know that a lot of my students get their information from places like TikTok, and I've even had some that say they want to be influencers, so that kind of hurt my heart. But I ask them, when they say, oh, well, this person on TikTok's talking about this and talk about that. And my one question is, who's educating the influencer? It's one thing to have an opinion. And I tell my students, I understand that you're going to say, I think, I feel, I believe. What do you know? And then they're like, oh, okay, I gotta actually, put some facts behind whatever it is that I believe in. As far as the postmortem is concerned, I have an article, I guess it's still up, Michelle, where we just basically at the end of the election cycle, it's just the points that I raised in that article, we try to cover as many as possible, especially emphasizing this notion that as part of a constitutional democracy, the expectation is that we will have a peaceful transfer of power, and that the party that did not win, they are expected to live to fight another day, and that all of your policy preferences and all of your chosen candidates may not win, but the expectation in politics is that it's not supposed to be a zero-sum game. You're supposed to win some, lose some. You're supposed to figure out what that thing is that's most important and go for it. And if you don't get everything, it's okay. And to just try and reassure the students that, well, basically the sun will come out the next day. That makes sense.
So I'm in a slightly different position, I think, on election semesters than a lot of folks are. As Michelle mentioned at the beginning, I actually coordinate our campus's campus-wide voter mobilization program, which I actually teach as a 3-credit grassroots political organizing practicum out of the Department of Political Science. So the folks that go into classes like the League of Women Voters to help folks get registered on campuses, on our campus, that's my students and the class that I run. And so in that class, sort of thinking, moving towards this election, one of the things I have really been working on and actually been in conversation with students about over the summer is that the messaging around voting from 2018 does not apply anymore, right? The kind of idea of voting is like a celebratory, let's go do this collective civic act, like that is not how students perceive voting any longer. I think that's not how a lot of people necessarily perceive voting. And I'm not at all saying that we should take kind of the celebratory moment out of it. I certainly think that that still should exist. But we're having to, one of the things I'm really working with my students on this fall around this election is, given kind of the context of this election, how do you best communicate with other students about what the choices are, and kind of thinking through what it means to make a choice when you're not excited about anybody at the top of the ticket, what it means to make a choice when you don't have faith that your policy preferences are going to move, frankly, at all, regardless of kind of what happens at the top of the ticket in the election. And so taking political science students who are actually really excited in some ways about politics and want to go into this and helping them figure out how to communicate with other students who feel differently about politics is really where I think about pulling the election into my class. In terms of the postmortem with those students, one of the things that I actually love about Vote Oswego is I talk about it to students is like, this is, I know they all have their own particular preferences. We're running a nonpartisan voter mobilization campaign. So those preferences are not up for conversation with the campaign staff. When they're staffers, they are nonpartisan staffers with me. And so the transition after the election is actually about, let's break down all of the skills you learned during this process and where you want to put them next. And so really thinking about what it is that kind of like elections are a moment, but theoretically, you kind of disband whatever campaign team you're on when you're on a partisan campaign. Those folks don't simply disappear. They go lobby for, they go work for, they go do field for somewhere else. And so what is it, like what skills did you get and where do you want to head now with what you know in terms of how to create the politics that you want to see in the world? When I teach this, I also am teaching Intro to American Government. And for that class, I try every week, regardless of kind of what the chapter of the textbook is, to be bringing in something that's happening in the elections is basically like a political artifact. I refer to them as political texts. So for example, this was an example I used last semester, but kind of coming into the election, the chapter on the bureaucracy, we read 12 pages of Project 2025 and then an argument against Project 2025, right? So it's sort of like, we've read this chapter about the bureaucracy. These are the stakes in this election around the bureaucracy, which many of them think have no stakes at all, right? It's the bureaucracy. And so really trying to pull in specific political texts that are of the moment that students would not otherwise be coming across. So interestingly, TikTok is picking up Project 2025 now. But I think that a couple months ago, they were not coming across, and trying to pull those things intentionally in a way that helps make kind of what is the electoral conversation more clear, and in ways that's more specifically connected to the intro content.
Great, thank you. I'm going to pull from a couple of the Q&A just sort of because they're really related to what we've been talking about rather than save them for the end. So there's 2 questions that are sort of talking about a campaigns and elections course instead of an introductory course. And so generally speaking, does anyone have any advice specifically for teaching a campaigns and election course? And then specifically, has anyone thought about how to address the assassination attempt on Trump in the course, and how this relates to everything else that we're talking about?
I was teaching the election course in 2020. Now, that, of course, that was a COVID election, right? We really didn't meet face to face. I did a lot. What I would do a lot of is, we would follow along the election. It's kind of similar to Allison was talking about the artifacts. Every class meeting was, okay, well, we're studying. I was looking at the 16 and 18 elections, and we'd always come and say, okay, well, here's the framework the authors are using to examine the 16 and 18 elections. What does it look like today? And so we would do a lot of that to try to keep it current and keep it up to date. Yeah, I was wondering, we're going to get a question about that Saturday's assassination attempt there, and I'm not sure how to respond. I'm not teaching this summer, and I'm kind of haven't thought much enough of the class of how to incorporate that. But the one way I had thought about it is, political violence, and that's not a good sign in societies when you see, that's the way to solve problems. I try to tell students, democracy is about resolving our differences, like what Athena and Allison were both talking about, through processes and not violence. So, that's how I'm not teaching the campaign election class this semester or fall semester, but that's what I would do if I were teaching it, is constantly looking back and say, okay, here's what we know about past elections, what's going on today, get whatever public opinion data I can find, current polling, anything like that, and put them within the current context.
I agree with Juan Carlos's approach. I'm not teaching a class on campaigns and assassinations, but there is a chapter in my book. And so one of the things that I like to do is to give the students an understanding of what previous campaigns have looked like. Who ran, why they ran, what their success was, why they dropped out, how they were perceived by the public, that sort of thing. And so I anticipate that I will be doing that again. And also pointing out how this particular election may not resemble what we've seen in the past, as early as, the 1970s, people were saying, there's not a dime's worth of difference between the two major parties, but now we know there are significant differences. And so, to get students to juxtapose what an election looks like, now compared to 30 plus years ago, that's one of the things that I'm looking forward to doing. The assassination attempt, I'm not really sure how I'm going to address it, but one thing I was thinking about is possibly looking at it from the perspective of other unsuccessful attempts, like, the attempt on Reagan in 81, sorry, to just sort of like let students see that, yeah, they all know that there are 4 assassination attempts that sadly were successful, but there were others that weren't. And, we can talk about how the public gauged these assassination attempts, what effect, if any, it had on that person's standing, that, president standing, whether it was just a single attempt or more than one. Because if I'm not mistaken, I think Ford somebody tried to kill him twice. So I'm not 100% sure of how I will approach that particular issue, but I do know that I want to add in the fact that this has happened before, and this is what we've seen as a result of this unfortunate phenomenon occurring in the past. And so we can just speculate as to what we will see going forward based on what happened on Saturday.
This is, for me, one of those places where I rely on political scientists that are willing to do the hard work of public scholarship. So there are some good pieces that came out from Good Politics, Bad Politics. I'm sure there's some others that'll be coming out soon. And so I just already started downloading pieces of public scholarship that are coming out from other political scientists to essentially just have ready for the fall. One of the things I like to do the first week of class, I do it in most of my classes, but particularly in intro, is I try to have 1 or 2 pieces of public scholarship that I really think speak to this idea of a question of like, is our politics broken? And if so, who broke it? Which is what I use as the overall question for my introductory class. And so there's a piece from, I believe, Monkey Cage from Julie Novkov. There's a really good piece from Julia Zari that basically sort of look through like if things are broken, like here are the signals of something being broken in some ways in American politics, and here's what you might think about as the consequences of those. And I found students kind of respond to those as they give an in to kind of like, this is how political scientists think about these questions, which might be a little different than what you're getting from other political commentary. And so I've just already been trying to find anyone who's doing that kind of hard, brave work of public scholarship on some of these bigger questions that I'll be able to leverage with students in the fall.
Thank you. And a follow-up question in the Q&A, which is, what are some of the best public scholarship sites that you recommend? I know you mentioned a couple. Are there others? Yeah,
Monkey Cage went away and it made me sad. I'll sometimes look at things in the conversation. I will, honestly, sometimes there are just folks I know who do good public scholarship that appears in places I don't really follow. And sometimes I will just Google names and see if things have come out. There are the folks from, this may be incorrect. I believe so there's Mischief of Faction, and then some folks from there now have the Good Politics, Bad Politics Substack. Right, so there's just a set of folks. I'm happy to go through my kind of saved lists and send some things in to Michelle and Bennett that they can share.
Great, thank you. And I think so the Monkey Cage is now good authority. So if people are looking for that one.
Yes.
Okay. Great, thank you so much. And so we started touching on this a little bit, but just to give people another chance to share any strategies that you have for helping students sift through misinformation and disinformation, any particular assignments or techniques or approaches that you use.
One thing that I do is I make sure that when we're talking about the media chapter that I show them the media bias chart. And I know that some people are a little iffy about it, but I basically make it a part of that particular chapter and show them, you know, if you follow one of these sites religiously, then this is, you know, somewhat objectively, mostly subjectively, where your information falls ideologically speaking. And so one assignment that I'm thinking about bringing back, I sort of let it go before COVID, just before COVID, is having students examine a single news site, but then select a liberal site, a left-leaning site, a right-leaning site, and a neutral site, and see how each one of them address the same issue. You know, what will get emphasized, what gets left out, how is the story being presented? Is it being presented like a news story, or is it more opinion? Can the story be located easily? Because if it can't be located easily, then it suggests that one ideological leaning may not see it as important compared to the others. And so that's one of the things that I'm hoping to do as far as like addressing the media and disinformation is concerned.
I actually do a version of that assignment in my intro class.
Okay.
Where they sort of, for a while, they have to follow. It's just like, what do you actually follow? Tell me about that. Follow the other side, and then pick one issue and follow across, which I like. I was actually going to say one of the things kind of to the sidestep of this question is I have had to start staging current events conversations so that I have an opportunity to sift through students' mis and disinformation in a way that I can't do it off on the fly. So I used to do current events conversations at the start of every class. Hey, what's going on in the world? Ask clarification questions if you have them. And too many things were coming up where I was, and like, I don't know what we're talking about now. And so I have started doing, they're like, for folks that are familiar with like the Muddy Point 1 point writing prompts or 1 minute writing prompts at the end of a class, I'll pass out index cards and basically say, like, you can give me a muddy point as your exit ticket. So something that was confusing you want us to come back to in the next class, or a clarification question or a question about current events. And I basically buy myself 48-ish hours to be able to interpret some of the questions, which occasionally when they were coming to me on the fly, I would not be able to like quite lock into like what it would be conspiracy theories. Like, it was just really hard for me to both interpret what the questions were and then figure out a good way to respond. And buying myself those 48 hours has, I think, made me feel much more comfortable and able to much more fully kind of help students work around, like, oh, I think this is what you're talking about. Here's some other sources that I checked out that you might want, that we could talk about. But I've kind of had to protect my own ability to respond to their mis and disinformation sources.
Yeah, one thing I work on too, these are great suggestions, and I'm learning so much on this panel, is to talk to students too about like what advocacy is, like in opinion pieces, advocacy versus news articles, and really help them try to understand those are not the same thing, and how to discern or to figure out which one they're looking at. So we do spend some time doing that, and we talk also about just, the way the media covers elections. And so they'll ask me, where are some good places? So I always give them, I guess we're going to Canvas this fall. So I'll post on Canvas here's some new sites, or like following Texas politics. These are some ones that work out. And then we've talked too about how so much of the articles are, horse race coverage. And so I want to learn about the issues. Well, you got to understand, a lot of them fixate on this horse race. And I said, and their attention span is very short. They'll cover one thing, and they'll all do the same thing, and then they all rush over here to cover this other issue. So I said, you have to watch out for their tendencies. And then I mentioned earlier, but also tell them, look out for the narrative. They love to have a narrative they decide on is going to be the narrative for the election, and how every fact has to fit within that narrative, or they'll try to distort everything to fit the narrative. So I said, watch out for that. So just, Ron, right? These are businesses trying to make money. They've got a tough job to do. They're covering things. Here's what they do well. Here's where they really fall short, and try to help them have a few tools to understand how to sort through the media. And it's not easy. I mean, I know we struggle with it, trying to figure out what's going on and what are some good sources.
Great, thank you. Another question, I imagine, we have a lot of people in the audience who teach American politics or American government classes, intro or other, but we might have people who teach other classes. So I'm curious about what advice you have for instructors who are teaching in other subfields who might not consider themselves to be experts in American politics, but are going to have students who want to talk about the election. What are some ways that they could be responsive to student questions in the context of other courses? Anyone want to jump in?
I mean, to me, it feels odd as an Americanist to say, like, here's what I think the comparativists should do. But I would think that in the same way that when sort of there are particular events that I'm certainly not an expert on, I will go back to kind of like, well, if my training in political communication and my training in sort of institutions helps me think through, like, a lens on thinking through this question, I think that's where I would go. And so kind of what folks were saying before about thinking about like democratic backsliding in a comparative context, I think there's some very obvious sort of expertise that folks outside of American politics have to be able to provide commentary and help students think through what's happening in this election. That's, I think, would be incredibly useful for students to have.
Yeah, and in the context, like Allison, I was thinking about this in terms of comparative politics. To me, for the comparative politics, it's just wonderful because it's so easy to get fixated on the U.S. and what's going on. You start comparing the U.S. other democracies, you start seeing different patterns, different, why is our turnout lower? Well, you need to study comparative to understand why our turnout's lower. And then, democratic success and democratic failure. Again, same thing, comparative politics is really good for that. And for those who teach, our political theory classes, it's not one of my areas. The whole idea of, what is just, what is good politics, and how does this even fit in there? So, I think, for us, really political science, we're all studying, some basic things about power, the ethical distribution of power, how government works, and things like that. So, we just have many different tools to approach questions from different areas. So I think all of us have the expertise to address the election within the areas of our expertise. So use your tools to do this.
I agree with Juan Carlos, and also I would encourage them to think about certain issues or certain concepts that are familiar to them, but we also address. So like I talk about social contract theory, and I spend a lot of time talking about Hobbes and Leviathan, and so when I couch that discussion of social contract theory in American politics, it makes students start to think. And I'm actually also working on an essay regarding that. Hobbes would be proud of what he's seeing today in the 21st century. So for people who aren't necessarily Americanist, I would suggest, first of all, talk to an Americanist in your department, and you may be able to tease out those similarities in concepts. Even though you might not be approaching them the same way, you might not realize that you have that similarity. And also just encourage them to get a recent copy of an American politics book. So that way, most recent, preferably edition, so that way they can sort of get a sense of what's happening, and then they can use their expertise to find those similarities in their own course that they're teaching, their own subfield of political science, and see where there are more similarities than there are differences.
Great, thank you. This next question sort of goes back to, Athena, one of your comments at the beginning around sort of student emotions in the classroom and kind of managing that, and also relates to one of our questions in the Q&A. So the question that I had was, what strategies do you have for supporting students during a contentious election cycle? And the Q&A question, which I think is similar, is when students with different policy preferences or candidates they support get into fights or become argumentative, how do you manage that in class? So I think those two are related. So feel free to take whichever thread you want to run with. But Athena, I might ask you to start since you touched on the student emotions earlier.
Okay. I've been lucky that students haven't devolved into a fist fight so far, knock wood. But emotions do run high, and I put it in my syllabus that by virtue of the fact that we're discussing politics, there's going to be some contentiousness. So, I have in the syllabus, be polite, be courteous, be respectful of the other person's position. Understand that when I'm asking you questions, I'm not picking on you. It's just I'm using the Socratic method. Critical does not mean what you may have heard it mean in the media. This is what critical thinking really is, that sort of thing. And I emphasize it over the course of the semester. And so what I've seen is students may address a contentious issue, but whenever it seems like the temperature is getting a little too high, and generally what I do is I let the students talk. I don't interject until I feel it's necessary to do so. And when I do, I'm usually able to bring the temperature down with, some fact that probably neither side has addressed to this point, or to ask a question that forces them to think. And that too sort of cools the temperature of the room. I see myself more as whenever we do discussion, I may proffer question, but by no means am I, taking over the discussion. I let the students discuss, the issue itself because, they need to understand how the other side thinks and how the other side feels and why the other side thinks and feels that way. They don't need my perspective because number one, we're already being accused of indoctrinating students, and I'm not with that. And number two, they are going to be cohorts when it comes to moving through this political system together. I don't have the same policy preferences or concerns necessarily because I'm so much older. So I want them to understand each other. And when the temperature gets a little hot, I just make sure that I cool it down by proffering another question or a set of facts so that they can ruminate on what's being asked of them and, bring the temperature down a bit, so to speak.
I was going to say, I am somewhat unfortunately, I have not in the last few years had students be willing to share with each other. They will come to my office hours and talk to me about their political opinions, but in terms of sharing in a group space where they don't know each other, their willingness to actually debate politics is incredibly low on my campus. So they will kind of talk to me about it in short writes. They will write things about it, but when their willingness to engage directly with one another is not really there. And so this is something that I haven't really had to directly come to. I would say in terms of kind of the broader question on supporting students, again, because of at least in the way I teach in the election years, where I have students who are really heavily engaged, but it's in this kind of nonpartisan space when they're in class. Those students require, I think, there's the kind of support that I think we talked about before in terms of our limitations as political science professors and needing to send them to kind of, counseling or some other places, depending on what kind of support they need. I think for a lot of students, it's the support that I think Athena was in one way referring to, which is you need to understand what the other side is saying. And you're kind of being locked in on one political position is actually stopping you from moving forward in the kinds of skill sets and career paths and all sorts of things that you'd be interested in moving forward on. And so I've actually worked with students on basically crafting oppositional media diets, for example, right? So if you're a student who comes to me to talk about politics, we're going to talk about everything that you pay attention to, and then I'm going to give you a whole opposite set of stuff for you to pay attention to. And so sort of thinking through for particular students, the kind of support may actually be more politics, but different politics. For a set of students, it's literally, please take all of these people off of your TikTok or off of your Instagram or off of whatever, right? It's actually trying to get them to detox themselves a little bit, and getting them to detox in a way that is about getting off the internet and taking specific actions. I think for a lot of students, supporting them in the kinds of politics that they want is actually about getting them to be in a community working towards the kind of politics they want. But for a lot of college students, depending on how the structures are set up on your campus, the ease with which they can find where do I take sort of my really big interests that I'm sort of developing in one space and figure out a place to actually be in a community with people trying to make progress on a particular issue can be tricky. And so again, the sort of taking the student's lead, right? This is the thing you're interested in, but you're coming to me with it entirely from things that you are reading or listening to. I think part of my role in supporting those students is actually trying to get them out of those spaces and into spaces where they can actually be doing some work. And so that's a big part of how I try to support students.
I actually think, when they disagree about stuff, this is a wonderful opportunity for us to really talk about democratic discourse and how, really being informed democratic citizens in our society. On the first couple of days of class, I'll have to share it with you later, find one that's shareable. I show them this image. You've probably seen this one. It's in a lot of psychology books where you show half the group one image, another group a slightly different image, and you show them one common image. And depending which image they saw first, they see an older woman or a younger woman in the final image. So I show them that, and we have a little fun pointing out the differences. Oh, I see it now. And I said, well, why are we talking about this? And then we have this conversation about, well, our prior experiences affect how we see the world. And so I say, this is, we have different perspectives. We have different experiences in our lives. So of course we're going to see things differently. I said, if you're a millionaire, paying for college isn't that big a deal. All right. Other folks, this is a tough go. You got to find ways to do it. Getting the books are expensive, et cetera. So we say, look, it's not about that you're seeing the world that the other person's wrong with this. It's just you've seen it differently than they do. So we want to give up who we are, what we believe in, but let's try to look at the world through a different set of lenses, right? And oh, now I understand why you feel that way about something, okay? Or why you think that, your experience did that. And I said, gosh, they tell you we don't talk about religion and politics. I said, well, good grief, we're in a political science class. Of course we're going to talk about politics, and we're going to work religion in too. We're not going to decide what's the one true faith or anything like that, but we're going to talk about how religious preferences can have an effect on politics. And so I said, we need to know how to do this. So we said this pretty soon early, but I always put the point out, and I think it was Athena brought this up, but there's facts also. So I tell them, for example, climate change, all right? The fact is it's happening. It's getting warmer. We're not going to debate whether or not the earth is getting warmer, okay? That's established. We can have very robust, good discussions about what to do. You can make a policy choice to do nothing, all right? You can make a policy choice. We always have electric vehicles next to our solar panels. Fine. But we can have great conversations about that, but we're not going to sit there and get stuck into things about what are facts. So that's another possibility there. And so we go through the semester like that, evidence-informed decision making. And I like to think, I haven't had a big blow up in a while. So I'm hopeful that setting it up like this and show them this is how we discuss politics. It's not these, you see on TV or videos of these people yelling at each other, screaming. That's not what we're here to do. We need to be able to discuss this, and we're look at, what are causes? Why do we feel this way? Why does the Supreme Court rule this way? What are the issues going on here? It's not so much about your feelings on this. It's, well, here are the facts about what we've got. And so I think that's worked in the past. So hopefully it works again fall 2024.
Great, thank you. And I think this question in the Q&A follows up nicely on this conversation. How do you attempt to minimize election coverage exposure burnout, where students might begin to feel indifferent or numb and maybe stop caring about educating themselves on election facts?
Well, frankly, I haven't really dealt with that. I know my own classes, I try to change the topics we bring up and not do too much, because I know they're not, political science majors is different. We can talk about that all day. But for the big class I've got, I try to, pace it and talk about different topics as well. That's not, maybe that doesn't answer it, but that's where I am on that one.
I think for me, I go back to the kind of what is the long term, like the APD of it, like what is the not of the moment, but what is getting us to this moment that they are likely not otherwise going to come across. And so I think that now it's a challenge to do that in ways that are interesting and grabs their attention in an intro class. That works better in some upper division courses. But I think to me that attempting to break them out of like this moment in time is the moment, and instead providing resources to help conceptualize this moment in time as an outgrowth of a whole set of other institutional conditions and political history and all sorts of seemingly mundane earlier decisions and choices, at least gives them something different than they would otherwise be getting based on what they're consuming. And again, I do actually, for students that are in that space where I think election, like the burnout is a real problem, I actively tell them to pay attention less, honestly, because there's a point at which it's not actually, they are not getting more informed. They're getting burned out. I don't believe they're getting more informed at certain points.
Even though the upcoming election will be weaved throughout next semester's class, we aren't going to talk about the election every single class period. There are certain things that the students will want to talk about, and we'll spend more time on that, and it'll be not only a nice, respite for them, but for me as well. So, if we're talking about a concept that students really don't care much about, like federalism, they hate that chapter. But when you frame it in the context of, issues like medicinal and recreational marijuana, they want to talk about that. So, the next thing you know, the whole class period's taken up and we haven't once mentioned, the presidential election. So in order to avoid burnout, we just won't discuss the election itself. And to Allison's point, I just tell them to just back away sometimes, because it can get overwhelming for us, and we do this for a living. So that's my plan so far.
Thank you. Another question from the Q&A. What advice do you have for stressing the importance of voting and encouraging students to register to vote when you serve a sizable undocumented student population? I want to encourage voting without alienating these students.
Yeah, that's a tough one, because you don't want to alienate students. Like in my class, when we talk about registering to vote, I mean, right off the bat, there are plenty of students who this is not an option, right? There's not. And so what they can do, and I tell them, even if you can't register to vote today, you can look at the form, you can follow along with what we're doing here. You can ask yourself, how else can you be engaged? How can you participate in another context? Because I think voting is, one of the forms of participation. And so, yeah, and that's, I think if you frame in the sense of, you're providing this to the students, and like I mentioned, tell them, don't say, how can I put it? I think in that case, I would just hand out cards to anybody who wants to look at one and make it clear, you don't have to register. You don't have to do that. And so they can go along, see it, feel, and they can hold on to it, and they can, point out too. I mean, even when I do this registration, plenty of students don't do it. I think I had 200 students last semester, 60, no, what that mean, 150 and 60 registered, which is a lot, but there's plenty we have a lot of local students. They're already registered at their house. Okay, I don't need to register them. Some of them are international, not an option. Others live in other states. They'd rather vote by mail there. And so, heck, for all I know, some have a record and can't vote. So I don't ask. So there's never any pressure to do that. So that's what I would do. It's more as an informative. Here's how it works. Learn about it. But yeah, certainly no judging, like, oh, you're better if you vote, and anything like that.
One of the things we do is try to make sure that there's something for everyone to be able to fill out if they want to, right? So for example, we'll pass out a pledge card that's sort of like, I care, like, here's an issue I'm really concerned about that has if you're interested in volunteering or hearing more from Vote Oswego, check this box. So if someone is not going to fill out a voter registration form, it's not sitting there unable to do something if they would choose to while other people are filling out a voter registration form, right? Everybody gets the same packet. And then there is sort of an opportunity to do something. When we use QR codes, everyone can go to the QR code, and there's a kind of opportunity to like sign up to get more information, or I'm under the age of 16 and so can't write, like, email me when I'm whatever age. So that there's something for everybody to do in that moment if they feel like they would be singled out by sitting there filling out nothing. I think the other piece, and this also goes along with what we're trying to do this year in terms of kind of reframing how we're talking about voting, is really talking about voting as one tool in a broader toolkit for democracy. That, like, democracy is not about voting. Voting is a component of democracy. It's a piece, but it is one tool. And so really thinking through and providing civic engagement opportunities that are very much open on skill building, civic discourse, all sorts of things that would be very much open to all participants from your campus, sort of regardless of status.
I agree with both. Students aren't really precluded from other forms of political participation. if they are undocumented. So I too emphasize the fact that voting is just one of the many types of activities one can engage in, to be considered participating politically. So I don't have that many students who are undocumented, at least so far I haven't, but in the past, in other institutions where I've worked, I've had more. And, I make sure to emphasize that participation can come in all different types of forms outside of voting. And so I emphasize those other different ways of, contributing to the political process besides voting.
Thank you. Another audience Q&A question. Are you all seeing more problems teaching college students about politics, or has it become better?
Personally, I think it's become better. I think the last few years, my students have been much more interested in politics. They know there's big changes going on in our society. They're seeing things in our political system. And so, the voter registration rights we have been very successful. My colleague who runs our campus vote effort has shown our participation has increased. And so, again, this is, my end of one here, but for me, I find more of them in the big classes are engaged when we talk about politics than I had maybe 15, 20 years ago.
I think it's improved, especially with my students of color, interestingly enough. So now I'm getting more discussion and people who are expressing their policy concerns and wanting to talk about them and talk about them in an open forum. And I love the fact that when I walk into the classroom, I don't necessarily have to talk the entire time, because depending on what we're talking about, students, before I even get into my lecture, they already have questions, or they have comment, or there's something that is weighing on them and they want to address with the body politic as it is. So it's gotten a lot more conversational. I've seen more engagement, and the students who aren't engaged are also more willing to tell me why they're not engaged. And so I'd like to say that there's been more participation and concern and interest. And on some level, amongst the political science majors, enthusiasm, because then they come to my office and they take up my whole office hours wanting to talk about that issue that, that they're on for that day or whatever. So I think the participation and involvement has improved significantly.
I would say in my upper division classes, I honestly think it stayed pretty steady. I think the kinds of questions they are interested in have changed. The kinds of things that students in upper division classes want to dig into and want to try to understand have shifted. In my lower division classes, as I said, it's the participation they'll participate in all sorts of ways that aren't actually sharing their political viewpoints. But when it comes to actually trying to get them to they will say that they want to hear what their peers think about politics, and then when asked to actually kind of engage that way, they really struggle. I honestly think some of that is a pandemic lag. Just like a comfort level in conversations with folks. There's a little bit of a struggle still there that we're kind of working through, and a real hesitance to sort of be quote unquote wrong about things. And so I think that has been a little bit tricky to address. But upper division, the same but different questions that they want to answer.
Great. So I'm going to ask the panelists if they have any concluding remarks here in a second. But before I do, one of the questions in the chat is more really a question for everybody, which is not just on the panel, but anyone watching, which is if anyone has a model syllabus for an American politics class, preferably one that uses some sort of standard textbook that includes activities, assignments, or discussion prompts related to the 2024 election. I would love to put this out there to anyone who's listening. If you do have syllabi like that, APSA Educate is a great place to share that. So please do consider, as you're putting your syllabus together for the fall, consider sharing that on APSA Educate so that others can see how you're approaching the class. I think people would really appreciate it. I also, we don't have the registration link out yet, but I also wanted to highlight our next webinar in the series is going to be on August 13th at 1 p.m. Eastern, and that's going to be on facilitating respectful conversations in the political science classroom. So it's going to pick up on a lot of threads that we've already talked about here, not just in American politics classrooms, but more broadly. So please be on the lookout for that registration link when it comes. And then I would just like to invite everybody, if you have any kind of closing remarks, anything that you didn't get to share that you think you'd like to share, and maybe we'll go reverse alphabetical since we started alphabetical before. So Carlos, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. To me, the main things we go through this and I talk with students and others is, really emphasizing seeking to understand, really try. We don't have to agree with folks, but, instead of, hey, why is this person like a jerk? Really talk to them, listen to each other, and let's seek to understand where we're coming from. And if we can do that, then we can have more of a conversation and really start, finding solutions to issues. We don't have to model politics and what we see in the past. We can really go forward from that. So seek to understand.
I agree. And also, I try to emphasize to my students that you will lay eyes on the Constitution and what it says while you are in my class. So every chapter, there is at least one article or one amendment. And so what I want students to be mindful of is that despite all the mishegas that we're seeing and hearing with the election, we all talk about the Constitution. We all talk about how much we love the Constitution. Well, now is your chance to actually lay eyes on it, see what it says, see how short it is, and how such a short, amazing document has lasted for this long. See how it's changed over the years. And so that's pretty much my perspective. And it's not only in my syllabus, but it is addressed virtually every week at some point in the actual semester.
I want my students to perceive themselves as people who are capable of contributing to big conversations and pursuing political change. And so I really try to emphasize that students have things that they really care about. They should own that those are the things that they really care about and the politics that they want to see in the world. But in order to make those things happen, they have to understand what will seem like arcane decision-making processes. They have to understand how levers of power work. And they have to be willing to think about kind of a long-term game. And so that's kind of how I orient the way I teach, is that I want students to own what they want to see. And then I see it as my job to help equip them to understand how things got to be the way they are, and that people did that, and that they can be the people who help figure out how things move in the next series of years. I think the other thing I'd say is that I have worked, kind of shout out to a colleague of mine, Josh Plenchner, in my department, who's our other Americanist. We both came from an APD background, and we thought that was a really good way to help students understand what's happening. We've actually just decided, kind of amongst ourselves, that we will use that as the lens through which we teach a lot of our American politics classes, and having that kind of interlocutor in my department to kind of say, like, we can use a series of common tools and common threads to give our students a lens that we think works and we think has a lot of meaning, has been incredibly helpful. And I don't say that in thinking that like everyone should be using APD, but more in if you have a lens that you think works and you've got a colleague who has a sort of similar lens, having that other person to kind of bounce, how are we going to help students work through this current set of questions, has been incredibly useful for me. And I'd strongly recommend other people kind of find those peers in your department and figure out how to use the power you have in your own classroom to leverage ways of making sense in conversation with students.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks to you, our three panelists, for being here and sharing your expertise, and thanks to everybody who is watching. I hope you all feel a little bit more prepared for your classroom this fall. Thanks again.